Backup is en route.
Do a call back for 8662
Suspect is in custody.
Hey guys, Tyler Ryan with the Unfinished Files, continuing our deep dive into the 1995 murder of a 15-year-old boy in Lexington, South Carolina named Brandon Vinson. Brandon went to work on a Saturday in June of 95. He was a bag boy at the Winn-Dixie in Red Bank, South Carolina. He doesn't complete a shift. His grandfather goes to pick him up. He's not there. The next time anyone sees Brandon, he's been stabbed 72 times and been left in a chicken coop in Lexington, South Carolina. Just 3 days later, investigators quickly develop a suspect by the name of Calin Radwill. Calin is brought back from Arizona to Lexington. He sits in jail for about a decade, about 10 years, before he and his attorneys make a plea arrangement. And what he takes for a plea arrangement, and this is important, is called the Alford plea. Alford plea. It's not the nolo contendere. It's not what you plead when you get a speeding ticket. You can plead guilty or not guilty, or you can exercise your Fifth Amendment right, your right not to incriminate yourself. Right? That's a nolo contendere. The Alford plea is different. The Alford plea basically says, I didn't do it. I'm not guilty, but I admit that there's enough circumstantial evidence. It doesn't look good for me, and I guess I'd rather know my adjudication rather than taking a chance that a jury of my peers could convict me for a longer period of time or a different charge or whatever. So Calin takes this Alford plea in 2005. He's out in 2015. It's an additional 10 years, so about a 20-year sentence is what this young man ends up serving anyway for the association with Brandon Vinson. Just after that, there was a radio program on WVOC AM, that's in Columbia, South Carolina, hosted by Dave McDougall. On this interview, very interesting interview, it's a three-part series for us here on the Unfinished Files. We hear Tim Vinson, who is Brandon's dad. We also hear from John Delgado, who is Calin Radwill's attorney, his defense attorney. Very interesting take on the case, on the evidence, on the way the whole thing was handled. It's a three-part series. This is part one. It's about 15 minutes long, but I want you to give it a listen and just hear the words of two people that are intimately associated with this case.
Joining us in studio today, Tim Vinson, the father of Brandon Vinson, who was murdered in 1995, and John Delgado, who represents the only person who was ever accused in that murder, Calin John Radwill, who was 17 years old at the time. For those who may have missed it, Mr. Delgado, just go over very briefly, if you would, again, why, if you contend that Mr. Radwill was innocent, he would accept and take such a plea as he did last month, which will, as I understand it, he will already spent 10 years in jail and will spend another 10.
Look, this is the way I explained it to Calin. No one was ever going to pay him back for the 10 years he had been in jail. And he also deserved to pay for being a loudmouth teenage braggart. He had said things that were then recounted to the Lexington County Sheriff's Department about how he had done this and why he had done this, all of which were factually impossible for him to have done. But when Calin Radwill said those things, and said them often and said them early, and continued to say things, I said to him, Calin, when you act the fool, then you've got to pay the price for that. And maybe your price is you have to spend another 10 years in jail for being somebody that you are no longer. When you're 17 years old and you don't know a soul in South Carolina, and you want to show yourself to be in the know and to really endear yourself to a peer group of a gang of teenagers in your trailer park, you say and do things. And he did. And I said to him, that was wrong, that was stupid, that was silly, and you got to pay the price for that. And that's what being in jail for another 10 years is going to mean for you. But nobody's going to pay him back for the 10 years that he had already spent on Gibson Road.
Do you think that Calin Radwill killed Brandon Vinson?
No, sir, I don't. I don't think the facts show that. I don't think there is any link to Calin Radwill. I mean, there are...
What evidence was there?
Now, there wasn't any evidence. That's the point. And I think the Vinson family needs to know that and hear that again. There was no DNA evidence. Our witnesses said to us, the experts that we conferred with, said to us there would have been DNA evidence from the skin of the individual who bound your son's hands together. Would have still been on that cotton twine to this day. When they went back and checked it, they checked it not once, they checked it twice.
They being the prosecution.
That's right, I'm sorry, the State Law Enforcement Division. It didn't match Calin's.
Whose did it match?
Yeah, there was some unfounded, my recollection is going to get hazy here, but there was some unknown DNA that did not match Calin Radwill's.
Or Brandon Vinson?
Or Brandon Vinson's, exactly.
So is there still to say the possibility that if through a databases that they can run these things through, that was there enough to identify somebody?
That would be a question for the scientists at SLED to evaluate. If that had been the possibility, they would have done that. Now,
you hope.
Well, I know. I'm sure the State Law Enforcement Division would have done everything scientifically proper and scientifically valid to have come to a factual evaluation of who may have been involved in that as far as their science and their ability to show that. But there was no DNA. There was no fingerprint. There was no footprint. How did your sons get driven to that spot? It's 15 or more miles from the Winn-Dixie to where this chicken coop is located, almost in Batesburg, Leesville. Calin Radwill had been in South Carolina for 3 weeks. He didn't have a car. Doesn't mean you can't drive a car without a driver's license. He didn't have a driver's license. He didn't have access to a car. We had him another 15 miles away in another direction all afternoon by various individuals, and none of whom really liked him, knew him well. Nobody ever came to see him at the Lexington County Sheriff's Department in 10 years. He didn't have anybody from that trailer park as a friend. Why would he, if he knew anything about this, why would he have withheld any information to the Sheriff's Department, to his defense counsel? I know who was the other person, or I was involved, but I can't just let this other person just skate by. It is just illogical, it's irrational to have looked at the death penalty and not have blinked. He would have told, he would have communicated, he would have noted who else was involved.
So that our listeners understand, up until the fall of 2004, Mr. Radwill's case was expected to be a death penalty case, meaning yes, he'd have been tried. If convicted, they'd had a trial, and the jury would have decided whether to execute him or not. So he was facing execution up until the fall of 2004.
That is correct. And in Lexington County, South Carolina, that's not an enviable position to be in as far as being a capital defendant or someone accused of a capital crime.
Tim, did you have a question?
Yeah, I've got two questions,
sure,
really. In your opinion, do you think that this murder could have been committed by one individual?
No, sir, I don't. And that's exactly a very proper question. We had an expert, a nationally renowned criminologist, who was going to testify on Calin's behalf. He said there is no way in the world that could have been done by one individual. Your son couldn't have been abducted and taken away from the Winn-Dixie without someone else seeing something if it had been one person. One person couldn't have confined your son and then driven your son away and then gotten him out of a car and done all the horrible things that were done to your son with just one person. There had to be two people. Absolutely, no question about that.
And the second question I got is, because of the plea that Calin entered into,
yes, sir,
he's no longer going to suffer any kind of prosecution from the judicial system. So if he is, or in some way is involved, what would stop him from stepping forward now and saying, okay, I really did, it's my fault, here's the other people involved?
Yes, sir. Except, sir, that he has said to me during the intervening 10 years, and when I next see him before Christmas, and the detention center, in the prison that he's located at, I expect that he'll say exactly the same thing. Sir, I'll take that to him, and I'll ask him, as his lawyer for 10 years, is there anything that you can give to the Vinson family to help them close this case for themselves? I will do that, sir. I pledge that to you. But, Mr. Vinson, I must also say to you that I don't want you to be encouraged by my going. I think the answer is going to be what I think I'm saying to you now. He will say, as he said to us for 10 years, I wasn't there, I didn't do it, I don't know anything about it. But I will go to him. Yes, sir, I will do that.
If Calin Radwill were so innocent, and if you were convinced of his innocence for the last 10 years, why didn't you bring this thing to a resolution, get it into court, get him get it resolved and either allow the Vinson family or the police to look for whoever did it, or why didn't you bring it to conclusion years ago?
It's a good question. Look, the law in the state of South Carolina vests the right to bring a case to trial solely within the power of the state prosecutor, the solicitor.
Who at this point in time for the 9 years was?
The 11th Circuit Solicitor's Office in Lexington, headed by Mr. Donald Myers. There is nothing that defense attorneys can do. There is something we can do. We can file something called a motion for a speedy trial. I want everyone that hears this to understand that has a very catchy title. It has no substance to it whatsoever. In my review about speedy trials prior to this case, I came across cases, first of all, to the only way that a speedy trial is given a defendant. You have to demand a right for it. If you don't demand it, then the case can lag, as in this case, for so many years. Now, I want Mr. Vinson and his family to hear this. We used every one of those years effectively and thoroughly, because what we had to do when this was a death penalty case, we had not only to defend the first part of the case, whether or not a jury would have found Calin guilty of killing your son, but then also we would then have to immediately go, within 24 hours, we would have to go into what we call a sentencing phase. In other words, all the things that, the wonderful things about Brandon, that you and your family, his sister, his loved ones, his classmates could have come to the stand and talked about what an exemplary young man you had in your family. We had to then try to show to a jury some of the dysfunctional aspects of Calin's life. He grew up with a very dysfunctional mother who was an alcoholic. Sir, during the last 6 years that he was in the Lexington County Detention Center, she didn't come to see him one time. She never wrote him on Christmas. She never gave him a birthday card. One time. The defense team became his family. We encouraged him. We tried to keep him together as best we could. But those are the types of things that we would have wanted to have shown. He grew up in a little trailer out south of a place called Sierra Vista, Arizona, maybe 3 miles from the Mexican border. It's as isolated and desolate an area as you've ever seen. Gorgeous in its simplicity and its desolation.
But and I don't know if I've missed this, and I've gotten a little off track. I'm still at a loss as to why, as the question was, this wasn't resolved quicker.
Exactly.
Why the speed?
Because we used.
The speedy trial.
I'm sorry. We used every bit of the intervening 8 or 9 years to prepare for both sides of this case. But number two, what we have to do is we have to ask for a speedy trial, and then to have the case resolved, that is, dismissed or thrown away because of a lack of a speedy trial. We have to show that we have been, that is, the defendant has been prejudiced in some way. That's a very ephemeral, very difficult little smoke to catch in a test tube and shake up and down to a judge and say, Judge, we've been prejudiced because this case has been delayed. We could not do that.
You in fact did that in the trial in November. You actually had a motion
certainly
for
a speedy trial,
for the charges to be dismissed because of a violation of his due process rights.
Now, that's a bit different. Well, we filed that after, and I have to say to you, sir, that was strategy.
Yes.
I mean, we then thought, after Mr. Myers and his outfit had been taken off the case, that we then had a strategic upper hand. We had 9.5 years of history preparing for this case. We knew this case better, factually, than any other entity in the face of the earth. Mm-hmm. We would have been foolish, and we would have been remiss if we hadn't moved then. We needed and wanted and did move for a speedy trial after Mr. Gowdy's solicitor's office was appointed to this case in late February, the first part of March.
Exactly.
So we did do that. Mr. Vinson, you had said at a break something about the gag order. It was my recollection that this was brought to the attention of Ms. Fullwood and myself from the solicitor's office. I can't tell you, sir, when that gag order was signed by the late Judge Westbrook. I know we didn't promulgate that. We didn't think of that.
Well, now, a gag order basically means that all parties, Mr. Vinson, Brandon's mother, any of the witnesses, any of the attorneys, prosecutors, police. The gag order basically says they can make no public statements about that. Do I understand that correctly?
That's correct.
Okay.
And
so everybody's more or less silenced or gagged. As
exactly.
And can you imagine what it's like for a family to be held in captivity? No verbal communication with the outside world. You can't express your displeasure with the way the prosecution is handling it. You can't express any kind of emotion. So what do? Do you bottle it all up and just hold it inside until it finally bursts out?
Who sought the gag order?
It's my clear recollection that this came to Miss Fullwood from the solicitor's office.
And I believe that's fact.
The solicitor sought the gag order.
Yes, and I honestly believe it's because of the number of times that the Vinson family and those that were involved with your family were continuing to pepper the solicitor's office about when will this case be tried, what's the status of it, what's going on, what's happening, why hasn't this been brought to trial? And I think Mr. Myers just got tired of having to answer that. That's my very clear feeling about that.
As I recall, I believe this was in 2001 that this came about. I believe your ex-wife and her mother had been in the newspaper, and there had been a newspaper story about why isn't this case coming up. At that point, it would have been about 6 years old in 2001. And as my recollection is correct, it was shortly after that the gag order came about.
Exactly. And they had written letters to the Attorney General's office asking to have the 11th Circuit Solicitor's Office taken off the case. They've got copies of the letter.
Meaning your ex-wife or
Yes.
Brandon's mother, I should say.
Yes, and her mother, my ex-mother-in-law.
His grandmother.
Yes, they sent letters to the Attorney General's office.
Very interesting. Our guest in studio, John Delgado and Tim Vinson. Tim Vinson is the father of Brandon Vinson, who was murdered in 1995, a case that took 10 years to get to court. And quoting the solicitor, in the early years, the case would never have gotten to a jury with the evidence we had, and Radwill would have been out on the streets. So instead, he sat in jail for 10 years, and nothing was done, much to the dismay of many people, including the Vinson family.
Very powerful, interesting words from John Delgado, Calin Radwill's defense attorney, and Tim Vinson, who was Brandon Vinson's dad. This program originally aired in 2015 on WVOC. Dave McDougall was the host you were hearing. It just adds, again, more questions than answers, I think, in this case. If you have any information at all, please contact Crime Stoppers, 1-888-CRIME-SC, or we can have a conversation here with the Unfinished. Any information you have on Brandon Vinson, who might have been involved, what really happened, how did he leave the store, how did he end up in the chicken coop? Anything, any tiny bit of information is going to be helpful to investigators, and we certainly will get everything where it needs to go for the criminal investigation side. But please, if you know something, hear something, now is the time.